Okay, so thanks everyone for joining us. We're going to have some more people that will be joining, I'm sure, here in the next few minutes, but I do want to be respectful of your time. And thank you for joining us on the Friday night of a long weekend. And you can blame Chris for scheduling that.
That's my fault.
It was your fault. So just before we get started, I do want to note that we are recording this and we will be posting it on a public channel on the Fort Nelson Chamber of Commerce's YouTube channel, so just be aware of that. And give 1 second, I just got a couple people here coming in. I do want to acknowledge that this meeting is taking place in the Northern Rockies Regional Municipality and Treaty 8 territory, and we acknowledge all the First Nations who have lived, traveled, and gathered on these lands. Happy as the representative from the Chamber to be able to host this public information meeting for the Ministry of Forest Lands, Natural Resources, and Rural Development on the draft Caribou Protection Plan. I'm hoping that'll be less of a mouthful in the days to come, Chris. And so I want to welcome you and thank you for arranging to do these public engagement sessions that you've been hosting all week. Just a couple of extra housekeeping items. I do have everybody muted to start, and I'll ask you to stay muted unless you're speaking, just to keep that background noise to a minimum if we can, and to type your questions into the chat, and we'll try and get to them all. And with that, I'm gonna just jump right in and turn it over to Chris.
All right, thanks for that, Deb. I really appreciate it, and thank you for setting this up and hosting this meeting and helping us out this evening. I know it's a long weekend at sort of late in the evening, but also know that you know, this plan has been on a lot of people's mind for a long time, and certainly want to be able to have as much information as we can provide today. So I just really appreciate everybody making the time to join us, and hopefully we can make this as clear as we can for everybody and answer everyone's questions, and we'll just go from there. So my name's Chris Cooper. I'm the strategic lead for the Boreal Caribou Protection and Recovery Planning in the Northeast region. With me today is Michael Huck, who's Land and Resource Specialist, who's been leading this file and doing the bulk of the work for moving this plan forward and getting us to where we are at today. So I want to go through several slides here. If people have questions or comments as we go through this, you don't need to wait. Please go ahead and let us know, either by putting it into the chat or taking yourself off mute and asking the question, or raising a hand or something like that. I'm a little limited because I'm just on one computer screen, so I'm limited in what I can see. I'm going to ask Michael and Bev to both kind of help me out monitoring the chat and looking for people if they want to have a question or want to provide a comment. I'll look to you guys to kind of just stop me and interrupt me, and we'll go through them as people have those.
Michael, I'll leave that to you first.
Absolutely. Thanks, Bev.
So as the title slide here says, this is the draft Boreal Caribou Protection and Recovery Plan. It's a draft because there's nothing legal about this at this point. No decisions have been made. We have not sent a recommendation to the minister for her review. We've briefed our executive as well as the municipality and Fort Nelson First Nation Chief and Council, and all of us collectively support bringing this draft recovery scenario forward for public engagement. But it's just that we're just doing public engagement to gather input and feedback from folks so that we can continue revising this plan as we move forward. This is an initial public engagement session. It's the fourth one that we've held this week. It's initial public engagement because we intend to continue having more public engagement sessions as we move forward over the next couple of months. One thing I want to just clear the air with on here is, we haven't yet been able to release the draft plan for public review, and I'm not able to share this PowerPoint with folks yet either, because when I booked all these meetings this week, I didn't realize that the annual estimates debate the government goes through also entails a media blackout. So during the estimates debate, the government will not release any publicly, what should be publicly available information like a draft plan like this until that debate is over. And then then they'll lift that blackout and we'll be able to share this out. And so that is scheduled for mid-March, on the 16th or 17th of March. And so at that point, we'll be able to make this information that we're going to go through today publicly available, as well as the actual draft plan. And so when we get to that point and people have had a chance to review this plan themselves and really wrap their heads around it, then we'll schedule more public engagement sessions so that we can continue talking about it. But I didn't want to hold off having these sessions this week because we had announced it, and we really are, ready to start getting people's feedback on this. And so we thought, well, we'll do these initial sessions, and then when we can get the plan out later on, then we can follow that up with additional sessions, and hopefully we'll be able to capture everybody and get as much feedback from the public as absolutely possible. So the purpose of public engagement, as I started to mention before, is to present this draft recovery scenario, answer all the questions that anybody may have, and start gathering your input and your feedback. That feedback will inform further revisions of this plan over the coming months as we get into the spring and continue revising and tweaking this plan. The draft recovery scenario to date has been developed through a collaborative effort in two different phases. The technical planning phase, which was done between Fort Nelson First Nation and the Ministry of Forest Lands and Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development. Once we got done with the technical planning phase, we moved to a strategic planning phase, and it was at that point that we invited staff members from the Northern Rockies Regional Municipality to join that planning table and apply that strategic lens to the technical work that we had amalgamated with Fort Nelson. This draft recovery scenario is based on a number of different factors. The first, the status of the boreal herds. And to be clear, we're just talking about the 4 boreal caribou herds that reside within the Fort Nelson timber supply area and within Fort Nelson First Nations traditional territory. There is a 5th boreal caribou herd, the Chinchaga herd, which is to the south of Fort Nelson. It's within the Fort St. John timber supply area. It overlaps other nations like Doig and Blueberry and Halfway River First Nations that'll want to be heavily involved in the planning on that one. It's also overlapping with the work that's going on with the Fort St. John Land and Resource Management Plan update. And then obviously now that we're getting into some broader Treaty 8 negotiations, that's where that herd planning will be fit into that session. So we're just talking about the Callender, Snake Satanay, Max Hamish, and Westside Fort Nelson herds with regards to this specific recovery scenario. This scenario is also based on the threats that remain to the population, to these 4 populations. That's based on the expectations of First Nations, communities, and governments. That's been done in consideration of industry needs and the viability of investment opportunities, the socioeconomic effects, and the effectiveness of different support tools. And these are the different categories that we're going to go through as we work through this PowerPoint. I do want to just take a minute to acknowledge all the hard work that the planning partners have put into this. So staff from Fort Nelson First Nation, as well as staff from the Northern Rockies Regional Municipality, have been working on this with us, with me and Mike and other folks from the province for quite a long time. We've put a lot of effort into it, and I really appreciate all the hard work that everybody's done to get us to this point here. So I just wanted to say thank you to our partners that have been working with us on this.
Chris, maybe before you move on, I see Sonia has her hand up.
Yeah, go ahead, Sonia.
Possibly not related to what you're about to present, but I did hear you just say other Treaty 8 negotiations. And are you referring to Blueberry, or are you referring to other Treaty 8 negotiations? And I don't know if you can comment on that or not.
Yeah, so I'm referring to the broader Treaty 8 negotiations that have come about as a result of the Yehi versus British Columbia court ruling.
Is there anybody that would update us, not in this session, on that information soon?
Yeah. So I think that the Northern Rockies stakeholder group has a meeting scheduled for March 18th and you should, yeah, this should be a fairly robust update, yeah, on what's going on across the Treaty 8 negotiations at that point.
Okay, we were going back the Northern Rockies Roundtable. Is that what you mean?
Sonia, you can call it a roundtable, and that's absolutely fine with me.
Going back and forth with Greg Mandola about the agenda, and that wasn't on our agenda yet. And so maybe I'll just pass that along as an additional.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, like we always did when I was up there, is you guys tell me what you want to talk about, and I'll do my best to gather information. Greg will do the same. So I would just kind of push him a little bit on that.
I'm going to jump in, Chris, because there is what you were talking about, a meeting coming up, and the invitation to that, Sonia, is on the Chamber's Facebook page, so you can register for that. I'll shoot it out as well to you, but and if I've got a chance here, I don't know if I can get it from here, I'll try and put the link in the chat, but anybody can register for it, and it's specific to that, and it's with Government of BC representatives, I believe. And I see, oh, sorry.
Is that different? I think that's different than what we had with Chris before.
Yes,
or?
It's specific to the decision, the Blueberry decision.
Which is different than the Treaty 8 negotiation question I think I just asked about. Yes?
Okay,
Chris?
all right.
I'm kind of out of the loop on it now, but it didn't start out that way. But yeah, I think it's obviously connected. I guess that's the best that I can beat it. But yeah, I'm out of the loop on it, and I don't think Mike is plugged into that specific file either.
Yeah, but we'll take it back, and Sonia will follow up and make sure that this conversation continues. Okay.
Perfect.
Yeah, and I can represent Northeast BC Wildlife Fund on that. We really valued the conversations we had with Chris over this last few years that we had the Northern Rockies Roundtable, and we're really trying to continue that conversation. And we all just want to help. We want to do the best for wildlife in the land and be allowed to be involved in some of those discussions. So I appreciate that. And any information you can give us or share us too, Mike, that would be great.
Okay.
Okay, and I see we have Urs and Tom's hand up as well. So go ahead, Urs. You're still muted. Okay, Urs is having difficulties. Let's move to Tom. In the interest of time, we'll come back to yours.
Yeah, just following up on what Sonia was just talking about on our Northern Rockies Roundtable. Chris was going to try to find us somebody that might be willing to take over his position as that he was mediating that before. So have we got any takers on that, or are we going to have to find our own?
No, so Greg Bandola is going to step in and continue those quarterly meetings with you guys.
Okay, thanks, Chris.
Okay, go ahead, Urs.
Yeah, good evening, everybody, and thanks for inviting me to the meeting. I have one question on the first slide here. It says consideration of industry needs and the viability of investment opportunities. Are we here talking just about oil and gas, or are you also talking with regards to tourism?
So tourism, we have not put a lens on. The industry needs and the viability that we focused on has been forestry and oil and gas. Realizing that doesn't cover all, some of these sessions have already been pointed out to us that, gravel is a pretty big resource across these Boreal caribou herds. We should be looking at that. Other sort of any industry that would cause surface disturbance, we can kind of look at the two big ones, forestry and oil and gas, and use those as a bit of a proxy. Just to be clear, we're talking about the 4 herds that are out in the muskeg, right? Like in the very northeast corner. We're not talking about caribou herds that are mountain herd, like the northern mountain herds, or the ones that would have more of an overlap with tourism activities.
Okay, yeah, I just would like to have tourism a little bit more involved in everything here, because it employs a whole bunch of people up here, employs people year round.
Absolutely.
It doesn't really take anything out of the area. It sustains itself to a large degree. And I just think it needs to have a higher profile in those decision-making processes. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that, Urs. Appreciate it. Tom, did you have another question, or is that your hand up from before?
No, that was from before.
So again, just as a visual, right quickly here, these are the 4 herds. The one in the light beige, Max Hamish, Westside, Fort Nelson, Snake, and Calendar. Those are the herd ranges that will be that this recovery scenario applies to. So the status of these Boreal herds, I think most people know that these caribou reside out in the large peatland complexes of the northeast corner of the province into Alberta and up into the Northwest Territories. The status has been informed by a couple of different factors. First of all, we started just with Indigenous knowledge and the monitoring that Fort Nelson First Nation have done over the years of these herds, as well as local observations. We brought that information in, and that's indicated to us that there's been a decline for as much as 30 years or more amongst these 4 particular herds. When we couple that with the most up-to-date survey and telemetry data, both within BC and Alberta, that information also indicates a steady decline in these 4 herds since the early 2000s. And so that continuing population decline, those trends of declines over a span of time, essentially cause these herds to enter into what you'd call a conservation status, both in BC and on the federal government level. In BC, they are red listed as imperiled, which means without some sort of intervention, these populations as well as their ecosystems are at risk of being lost. At the federal level, under the Species at Risk Act, they are listed as threatened, which again means basically without some sort of intervention on our part, these populations are at risk of becoming extinct in BC. And so this graph here is just showing you over a span of the last 8 years. So this is based on our telemetry and survey data for the last 8 years between 2014 and 2021. We see that we're seeing a negative growth rate, so below 0 essentially, when you average all of those 8 years together. Now, some years you'll have a decline in a particular population, and then the next year you may see that population in a positive light or growing. And then the next year, and they may grow for a couple of years, and then the next couple of years they're declining again. But again, when you average all of those years together, when you look at those growth rates over time, we see that all 5 of these Boreal caribou herds do continue to decline over that time period, some much more than others when you look at like the Westside Fort Nelson herd compared to Snake Satanay. Why are they declining? Well, a number of different reasons, and some that are within our control and that we can address through this recovery scenario. There are some factors that are contributing to the decline of caribou across the province and actually across the country that aren't necessarily within our immediate control. You know, the larger global climate changes, global warming, which is we're seeing more intensive storms, more intensive weather events, longer fire seasons, more intensive fire seasons, things like that add pressure to these herds and can cause them to decline. That's not something that we can immediately address through herd planning or recovery scenario. But what we can address are the things that we know that have caused fragmentation of the caribou habitat and have set some factors up to really contribute to these continuing declines over time. We know from an industrial perspective, when we have a lot of commercial forestry out there, that promotes, the regeneration of browse, which is great and brings in more moose and other ungulates like elk and deer. When you increase the population of those prey species, you'll also increase the amount of predators that are coming into that same area, following the migration of those or the increase of those particular competition species as compared to caribou. Add to that, in linear features from oil and gas activities, seismic lines, pipeline right-of-ways that have been cut across this peatland, this muskeg, which normally wolves and other large predators wouldn't go into because it's just too difficult for them to travel and be effective at hunting. Well, when you fragment the habitat and you create these linear corridors that are essentially access points for wolves and other predators, then you increase the occurrence that these predators will come across the caribou. So you make more access through industrial development into areas where caribou use for their survival by avoidance, and you increase the numbers of those predators because of their primary prey that can be increased through industrial development. And that is what has contributed to largely, not completely, but largely to these continued declining growth rates in each of these four herds. So I mentioned earlier that we did this planning of this recovery scenario in two different phases. We started with a technical phase. And so what we wanted to know first is, as of today, as we're starting this planning, where are these herds, where are these animals living and thriving, where are their travel corridors at, what's their core habitat right now based on the most up-to-date knowledge and data. And so, as I mentioned before, we started with Fort Nelson First Nations indigenous knowledge, as well as local observations of where we're seeing these animals live, or maybe where we're not seeing them, or we used to see them before. We also looked at habitat suitability modeling by taking Duck Unlimited's enhanced wetland data and converting that to habitat suitability for caribou. And so that gives us an idea of across these areas that we're seeing the animals living at, how suitable is that habitat for them, as well as the fringe habitat where we may not see quite as much use, but we can judge, how suitable that habitat is for also supporting those herds in their core habitat. We also looked at the existing disturbance that we know is across the land base, and there's a couple of different ways that we can do that. One is through the Regional Strategic Environmental Assessment, or the RCEA data set, that gives an indication of the amount of disturbance that has been brought about by industrial development, as well as other natural disturbances. And then we have all the known industry footprint over time, the linear features, the aerial disturbance from cut blocks, roads, pipelines, seismic lines. What we don't have a good handle on is the amount of regeneration. So obviously a lot of the industrial disturbance out on the land is older, and cut blocks regrow, seismic lines and linear features, they can regenerate. But we're also, again, in the muskeg, in that peatland that doesn't tend to regenerate as readily as some of our higher, drier areas, essentially. So we don't have an absolute 100% clear snapshot of the amount of disturbance, but we know what the historical disturbance was. And so we can at least use that as a bit of a proxy to kind of judge, okay, we can see where the caribou are actually at. We have that visual data and that telemetry data. We understand the suitability of the habitat, and we understand where industrial development has been before. And so that kind of builds a picture of high use caribou areas and really intact versus high use caribou areas that have had more historical industrial development to it versus areas that have low or little to no known caribou use. And so that's how we delineated the new core caribou habitat as well as the matrix habitat for these four herds.
Yeah, Chris, I'm just gonna, sorry, I was just gonna interject and invite Sonia to ask a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Waiting for you to finish, Chris.
Obviously I'm chomping at the bit to see the data analysis. I know that you can't share that yet, but question for either of you, when the technical folks looked at those disturbance footprints, was it through time? I heard you talk about through time, Chris, but like, did you look at like 0 to 10 years since disturbance, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 40, etc.? Or was it just here's, for example, the footprint of fire since 1922? Or you might not know the answer. I'd be really interested to know how that was
Yeah.
captured.
Mike, can you speak to that? Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. So this data set, it amalgamates existing provincial layers for roads and cut blocks and other features that you typically associate as human-caused disturbance. And so some of the data itself has attributes has a timestamp of when that disturbance occurred, whereas other data, like a lot of the seismic data, it does not. And so there's known issues with some of the data sets to be able to understand when disturbance came, to be able to model how long far out we would anticipate whatever the feature may be to regenerate. But the purpose of the disturbance assessment was just to understand where's the most important caribou areas and what's the scale of relative intactness. Because as you'll see later on, not all core caribou habitat is being managed for a positive habitat trend. So we wanted, as a technical team, to be able to identify areas that have more disturbance, because that could influence management decisions going forward.
Sorry that I'm going to ask a bunch of like more data questions, but not everybody might know what a positive habitat trend is. Do you think you could describe that?
I'd say in its most simple form is that over time, you have more of the habitat coming back to a state that's older for caribou, that's more suitable for caribou use. So we're talking about natural regeneration or restoration on seismic lines and roads to be able to grow plants in there. But over time, through GIS mapping, geographical, I don't know how best to explain that one, but through digital mapping, we're able to create a footprint of disturbance. And so the idea is to have less footprint in 50 years than you have currently within some of these areas that are really important to Boreal caribou.
And I think thanks for running us through that, Michael. I think that I just get concerned, obviously, especially when we're talking about fire, but when we paint the brush of fire or disturbance with the same lens and we don't break it up in time since disturbance classes. And I understand it's a big data set. Is there mention in the plan any of the weaknesses of the analysis or the data? Not having seen the plan, like is there a paragraph that explains some of the challenges associated with some of the data?
So this particular data set, it's available through Data BC, and I believe technical methods are available there, and that will speak to limitations. It was developed out of it with a separate process. We just used it, so I can't speak to, all the nuances of that data set. But well, it was created because of the very question that you have. There's a lot of different people and stakeholders and First Nations in Northeast BC that are dealing with disturbance questions. And so this project was to create a trusted source of information between industry, First Nations, and government to be able to utilize to inform land use planning decisions like this. So that's where this data set has its roots. But like any modeling, there's going to be limitations to its applications.
For sure, and I agree, and I know we need these kind of data sets, but if this is the foundation, and I was listening the 2 meetings ago, but only half able to listen at that time, but if this is the foundation for how we're moving forward on planning, then I really do feel it's worth at least 1 or 2 sentences in the plan to acknowledge that, like I know that the way that the model was run, we can find that other information, but if it's not upfront, if it's not addressed in the plan, it would just be like us publishing a manuscript without talking about the weaknesses in our data set? Like there should at least be one or two, an acknowledgement that it's not complete.
If I, yeah, sorry to cut you off, but yeah, I agree. And I wouldn't be surprised if we have an acknowledgement within the methods document.
Okay.
So you'll just have to bear with us and be patient if you may, so until we're able to post everything on an Engage portal.
But patience is not my middle name. But thank you. Yeah, and thanks, Chris, also for letting us ask those questions. I think from Northeast BC
Sure.
Wildlife Fund, habitat is so incredibly important to all of us, and making sure we're all talking about the same, looking at it through the same lens. So thanks.
Thanks, Sonia. So once we compiled that caribou use data and got that delineation of the core caribou habitat and its matrix habitat, we then did a high-level initial industry assessment. So taking that caribou use layer and layering it over our petroleum natural gas information. So looking at where all the existing conventional and non-conventional tenures are within these herd ranges, as well as looking at all the existing liabilities. So the active well sites, as well as abandoned wells, orphan wells, legacy seismic lines and roads and things like that, to see how that would be overlapped by the caribou use. We did the same thing for from a forestry perspective by looking at the province's timber harvesting land base layer, and then not just within the timber harvest land base, but then a look at the merchantability of that timber harvesting land base. So just right quick, the province's timber harvesting land base for the Fort Nelson Timber Supply Area includes up to 20-hour cycle time from the middle of Fort Nelson where you might have a plant. So not all of our timber harvesting land base is merchantable or economically accessible. So we did, again, just sort of a high level look at, well, what's the merchantable part of the timber harvesting land base and how's that overlapped by these caribou use areas? We also did some resource forecasts from an oil and gas perspective. And then Fort Nelson First Nation took that information and overlaid it with their land stewardship framework, which captures all of their other cultural values, like, so their cultural values, cultural sites, sensitive areas, things like that. Again, to see, how caribou use and these values overlap with each other. I see that there's a message in the chat, but I can't actually see the chat. Is there a question?
I have it. It's another one from Sonia, and she asked if a definition of matrix would be useful to share. And yeah, I can just share. So when we talk about core habitat, we're talking about the habitat that is most used by caribou through known telemetry or indigenous knowledge and local observations, or habitat that has biophysical attributes similar to what you would expect boreal caribou to find. So large peatland complexes, treed bogs, and fens. And then matrix habitat is the area outside of core habitat where you might have a periodic caribou use, but it's not where caribou spend a lot of their time, but it can be important for moving between core habitat areas. And the matrix habitat also supports the rest of the influencing aspects that might for caribou. So if it supports your other prey species like moose and elk and deer, and as well as wolves, and where they spend a lot of their time. And it's important because there's this idea that you should manage matrix in order to manage all the effects coming into core habitat. Because these animals have different home ranges, it makes it a real tricky issue. So when we're talking about core caribou habitat, we're talking about one thing, and then the matrix habitat, we recognize that there's indirect effects for caribou, but it's not really the primary area that we want to focus our management efforts on.
Thanks for that, Mike.
Yeah, I think I should have just read a definition of matrix habitat, but I tried to explain it.
All right, you got it. So that was the bulk of the technical planning phase, gathering that data where these animals are at and taking that high level look over, what the implications are to what we know we have on the land base. It was at this point that we realized that we needed to move into more of a strategic planning phase. And so as was that point that we invited the Northern Rockies Regional Municipality to join the planning table and apply this strategic lens to that technical work that we had put together with Fort Nelson First Nation. And so we started looking at what the implications were to different industries. And we started largely with forestry, looking at the overlaps with the timber harvesting land base and how that would potentially impact the allowable annual cut. And we'll get into numbers here in a little bit. But we looked at that overlay. We took into consideration the existing forestry investment opportunities. So when we were in the technical planning phase, at that point, this was like sort of late 2018 into 2019, folks may remember there was a proponent that was looking to reopen the OSB plant. And that was intended to be in partnership with Fort Nelson First Nation. So while we were going through this planning, there was a ton of information being shared between Fort Nelson First Nation and the proponent that was wanting to open the OSB plant, as well as between the province and that same proponent, to understand what their needs were, what the scale of the operation would be, the volumes that they would need, species, what was economical and what was not economical from a fiber basket perspective. And so we're able to kind of really understand what that particular opportunity may need. Unfortunately, that opportunity did not come to fruition for reasons that had nothing to do with caribou or the fiber supply. But then a little later on, and currently still sort of on the books, is a proponent that's looking to convert that OSB plant into a pellet production facility and be an equity partner project with Fort Nelson First Nation. And so this is, we're heavy into the strategic planning phase of this, and the same kind of situation. There's a ton of information being shared between the proponent and the nation from an equity partner standpoint, but then also a lot of work between that proponent and the province, which we were able to bring that information to the planning table so that the staff of Northern Rockies Municipality was also able to understand what was needed there, what was the scope and the scale of this project, where's the economic fiber supply for them and what are the implications. Same time, during all this time too, there's been some specialty product interest as well. So like furniture makers, there's a person that's interested in making pallets out of aspen, biodiesel out of waste wood. So, we're gathering all this information to see how all these different potential investors might be affected. We also realized during the strategic planning phase that because forestry had been dormant for so many years, the province sort of didn't have the most up-to-date information as far as the economical part of the timber harvesting land base, the road network, cycle times, and things like that. And so we realized where we updated the caribou information, we needed to update our forestry information as well. So we commissioned Industrial Forestry Services out of Prince George, who had been concurrently doing work in the Fort Nelson timber supply area to provide a report for us on what the stand volumes were, leading species, cycle times, age classes, and then we provided them some preliminary information around what we were looking at as far as caribou use. And again, they were able to overlay that information and show us how that could potentially impact the most up-to-date forestry information for us. And so we took all that information, what the province had, as well as the information that we commissioned from IFS and what we knew about the potential investment opportunities. And we're able to start driving towards a targeted economic fiber supply within the timber supply area. And so, I don't want folks to think that we designed this recovery scenario just to support an OSB plant or just to support a pellet plant. But what those investment opportunities did give us a good indication of is, if in forestry investment is going to come back to the Fort Nelson TSA at some point, you need a fairly large player that can handle the amount of deciduous that would be harvested at a commercial scale, because you can't just go after one species or another in this mixed species profile. You need a local facility to handle the amount of deciduous that would be harvested on a commercial scale. And because of the distance to markets, you need a fairly large facility that can handle that deciduous component of it. So it just informed us of what we needed to in order to ensure the viability of investment opportunity in forestry. We understand what we basically need to have available and where those stands are at, what the stands look like, and how economically they are, whether do they fit in the right cycle times in order to support the investment of that scale to be able to be viable. And so that's what we took all that information and really built a targeted economic fiber supply and looked at how caribou recovery would impact that. Similar from an oil and gas perspective, we worked very deeply with the Ministry of Energy and Mines and Petroleum Resources. It's now Emily. They just changed names, and the Oil and Gas Commission, looking at where those existing liabilities are at and what the industry forecast was for, or currently is, for oil and gas to potentially return to the Fort Nelson area. And that's based obviously on market demand, price of gas, but then also the volumes and the long-term trends for the volumes in more economic areas. So I'm talking about the Montney Play to the south, and the projections for that area to supply the abundance of gas that BC is currently going to need and want to export for the next sort of 10, they're calling 10 to 15 years to draw from that Montney Play before the demand would and pressure would push oil and gas back up into the Fort Nelson TSA. That's not absolute. That is something that needs to be monitored over time. And so our ministry and oil and gas and energy and mines will continue to monitor these projections, as well as this when we get into the implementation of this recovery scenario eventually, to see how things are working along and what changes are coming in the future. But we can at least get a good idea of how oil and gas would be impacted based on their forecasted projections for demand to return to that area. And so all of this information in the strategic planning phase allowed us to essentially develop a set of management intents for industry that would do two things: allow industry to function and be viable, and for investment opportunities to be viable, but also in a way that would manage industry in a way that it will promote a positive habitat trend. So what Sonia and Mike were talking earlier about is that we're seeing the habitat come more together, and even you can actually have industry on the landscape and still have a positive habitat trend. And we'll talk about the details on that here in a minute. But that's what has driven the drafting of this recovery scenario, is to attain two things: to attain a moderate to high probability of achieving self-sustaining populations over time. So the caribou populations to become self-sustaining, that'll be achieved through more of their habitat being intact, as well as ensuring the viability of industrial investment opportunities. And so this is the scenario. This is the recovery scenario at the end of the technical and strategic planning phases. So I'll take some time. I'll kind of go through this slow because there's a ton of information here. But just to kind of walk folks through it, there are 4 management types, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Type 1, the green, is the most restrictive for industry. So it would be full restrictions from all industries that would cause surface disturbance, essentially, within all of these green areas. So the corner up here of Callender, down and through here, down through Snake, Satanay, down the bottom bit, up through West Side, Fort Nelson, and then over this western edge of the Max Hamish range. All of that green area would be restricted from industrial development that would cause surface disturbance or would further degrade the habitat of these herds. These green areas would also be the top priorities for any restoration investment. So we all know that there's a lot of funding and a lot of work being done towards restoring the habitat, and a big focus on the whole northeast region of British Columbia, but certainly up here in these Caribou ranges, we're going to see a lot of restoration and a building of a restoration economy within this region over the coming years. One big piece to that is if the government and both the provincial government, the federal government, and other agencies or other entities that want to invest heavily in restoration efforts, they also want some assurance that later on down the line that restoration work is not then going to be redeveloped and chewed through by industry later on down the line. So by fully restricting industry in these green areas, it gives that insurance. It protects that investment in restoration in these coming years. The yellow areas, which is management intent 2, if I can get my mouse to work here, here we go. So these yellow areas would be restricted from forest harvesting, but they would allow conditional oil and gas activity or development. And the reason why there's that difference is because within these yellow areas, there is already a large amount of existing oil and gas tenures, both conventional and unconventional tenures. And so we have to maintain access for those rights holders to those tenured areas. There's also within the yellow, all of your active wells, as well as legacy infrastructure. So your abandoned wells, orphaned well sites, your pipelines, and those types of things. And so there's existing liabilities that those rights holders also need to be able to get in there and address, whether it's to reclaim or restore abandoned and orphaned wells, or if, because there is a little bit of activity going on out there, certainly, the environmental protection and repairs need to be done on that existing infrastructure. And so within the yellow areas, we're ensuring access of those right holders to those existing liabilities, but we're not allowing new surface disturbance from those activities. So it's similar to the green in that we're trying to eliminate surface disturbance, but oil and gas does need to have that access within those areas. Management type 3, which is this pink or fuchsia area. So that would be open to forest harvesting, conditional forest harvesting, the conditions being that forestry would have to adhere to the general wildlife measures that may overlap these areas, and conditional oil and gas development. So you can, within the pink areas, have surface disturbance from forestry and oil and gas. But again, forestry's got to adhere to general wildlife measures. Oil and gas will have to adhere to updated procedures and policies for conducting oil and gas activity and building or developing more oil and gas infrastructure. Lower priority for restoration, not that we wouldn't do restoration in those areas, but it does lack some of that protection of restoration investment. And then when we get into the beige areas, so that's a sort of outside of Caribou range, outside of high Caribou use areas. So again, this is open to industrial development, so you can have forestry and oil and gas. The same conditions would apply as these pink areas do, and that would be a lower priority for investing in restoration of that. So I'm going to pause there for just a second, because I know that's a lot of information to take on and a lot of different colors that we're dealing with here. So I'll break for a second and see if folks have questions about this.
Well, I see Tom's got his hand up, but maybe if I can ask one from a layman's perspective, what does this mean recreationally for our recreational users of the backcountry?
So, from a snowmobiling perspective, we're not restricting any access. So that addresses some backcountry users, hunters, trap liners. We're not cutting off that access for those guys. We're not restricting the use of snowmobiles out here. over time, when you see some of these linear features get restored, that's something that we'll really have to take into consideration, is especially from a trap liner perspective, is, you know, if you're going to have restore a long part of a seismic line or a linear feature, we want to make sure that we're not destroying somebody's access that they've been using for years and years. You know, from just a pure recreational perspective, if, you know, if there's lines or right of ways that are linear features that folks have been using from a recreational perspective, that may then get restored at some point, you know, we'll have to consider that as restoration activities come about. But this recovery scenario is, and these management intents are applied to industrial development, not to backcountry recreational users.
Thanks. Tom, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I just want to clarify there on the yellow area where there's, you say no new surface disturbance for petroleum, natural gas. Is that, like we talked about that at a couple of the last meetings, that doesn't cover multi-well pads if they're not taking any new area. But if they do need new area, is that a trade-off? Can you do a trade-off on that for do restoration in another area and take some new surface on the yellow area?
So if we get into a situation, and again, this is something that's going to have to be monitored for both for progress and for changes in market demand. But the intention there within that yellow area is that if a rights holder needed to create new surface disturbance, if they couldn't do their work within an existing footprint, then we would be looking for the requirement to offset that new surface disturbance. So if you disturbed a hectare of land, you'd have to, or if you made so many kilometers of linear disturbance, you'd have to offset that by restoring more than, I'm not sure what the number would be, but more than what you would disturb, so that you're still driving a positive habitat trend within those same areas.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that, Chris.
Sure.
Sonia, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I have two questions. What is the white area in the center of the donut around Fort Nelson that doesn't have any colors on it? And my second question is, it's a really interesting shape where we've got Muskwa West Side connection. And can you talk to us why there's such a linear, like what's up with that linear corridor? So those two questions.
Okay, I'll start. Chris, do you mind if I field these ones?
How about it?
All right. So that AOI for the Muskwa West Side connection, what informs the delineation is that when we took the telemetry data and we developed a kernel density estimate, there was a caribou collar that frequently went up to that area. And so it's informed first by telemetry, but then through discussions with Fort Nelson First Nation, we heard that area seems to be an important migration corridor for caribou coming from the Parker and moving to the west. So that's what informed that delineation. As for the gap around Fort Nelson, the range boundaries, they generally follow major rivers and streams or other kind of topographical features that make sense. But within that area is always, when we looked at expanding range boundaries, we just never drew any range boundaries there, but I'd assume it'd be very similar in terms of matrix, given its proximity to Parker and other kind of core areas for caribou.
It's not like that's all going to become a giant clear cut.
No, that would be a really big clear cut. I think the scale of this map could be confusing considering we're talking about such a vast hectarage of land. So, you know, one of the things that we're going to do is release KMZ files as part of the public engagement, so people can kind of zoom into areas and really start to look at this stuff at their own leisure, using applications that they're familiar with, such as Google Earth and Google Maps.
I think that would be really interesting because there's a lot of like just from a landscape level, like there's some interesting shapes, and it's hard to know at the scale that the map's been provided to get a grasp. I mean, if we all are familiar with how big Cacho Lake is, that kind of gives us a little bit of reference, as well as how big Max Hamish is. Yeah, I think that there's going to be some really good feedback once we're able to get that on Google Earth and we can all zoom in and zoom out. And, you know, there's lots of places where caribou go between the mountains and the muskeg. And so I wouldn't be surprised if you learn of some more of those corridors, even if they're not on collared caribou.
100%. That is, it's through engagements that we're actually hoping to be able to receive the kind of feedback that can improve upon the plan and the outcomes. So that way, through implementation, there's a greater likelihood of success in recovering these species.
Just one final question, because nobody else has their hand up yet. So what happens, like we're in the fire cycle, right? And so the Chinchaga fire from 1950-51, which was one of Canada's largest fires, that was however many, that was whatever it is, 70 years ago. The egg and the tea fire were in the late 80s, late 70s to 80s. We're expecting there to be some large fires walking across this landscape. So if we do get a large wildfire event, does that mean that that's going to influence the area, influence like the hectages associated with each of these 1, 2, 3, 4 types? Because there will be that disturbance on the landscape, or how will that interact with what you proposed?
Yeah. So along with this plan, there is an adaptive management strategy. So it's a schedule of monitoring, such as large wildfire events. And you will look at the objectives and the outcomes that are feeding those objectives to be able to have a conversation 10 years down the road if a major wildfire takes place. In neighboring jurisdiction, Alberta, they just completed a similar caribou plan for the Bisto range planning process, and they established a threshold that if any range experiences greater than, and I don't remember exactly what the number is, but let's say 20% of the range is burned by wildfire, then they would immediately look at the management strategy. But we don't have that resolution right now. But the idea is that you look back and through implementation and effectiveness monitoring, we'd be, looking at this line of work again in due course. The last plan, for example, was released in 2010, and now we're about 10 years later, and we're looking at it again. So that's kind of the planning cycle on these things.
Thanks, Mike. So this is the next slide. I'm using the same map here, but the next slide that we're moving on to is what are the proposed implications for boreal caribou under this recovery scenario? So what we're doing here essentially is increasing the amount of area that is being managed for a positive habitat trend by 1.65 million hectares. So currently, Mike just mentioned that there is an existing plan from 2010 that has placed protections on this area specific to boreal caribou, and that's about 800,000 hectares across these 4 herd ranges, which represents roughly 21%. So we're gonna, or this recovery scenario, if it moves forward, would propose to add 1.65 million hectares. So that would increase the amount of area that we're managing for a positive habitat trend to about 2.5 million hectares, which would represent roughly 63% of these 4 herd ranges combined. That gives us between a moderate to high likelihood of achieving a population self-sustainability for each of these 4 distinct herds. So they're not all exactly the same. Across these herds, we achieve between 52 and 94% of each individual herd range that is being managed for positive habitat trends. So if we look at like West Side Fort Nelson here, where you see green and yellow, but you also see quite a bit of beige and pink through here, some more restricted area, more open to industrial development, and then towards the bottom, it's back into restrictions again. That's around 52% of this range that's being managed for positive habitat trend. Compare that to the calendar range up here in the corner, where you hardly see any beige and no pink. You're getting 94% of this entire herd range. That's the core and the matrix habitat that's being managed for positive habitat trend. If we drill into these herds just a little bit closer, we talk about core habitat, where those animals are really living and thriving, versus their supporting matrix habitat. At a core habitat level, we're achieving between 78 and 100% of each of these 4 individual herd ranges that's being managed for a positive habitat trend. Sonia, I see you got your hand up. Go ahead.
I'm following, I think I'm following along, and I think this is where the confusion happened in our community. And everybody that read 1,656,219 hectares on the front page of the newspaper last month, because we didn't realize where, like, it's such a that's a real precise number that came from some form of analysis. And so where, just to start out with, and I also really think that as soon as lots of us are able to see these files, so we can really fully understand what these hectares translate to on the ground and the percentages, where does the 1.6 million hectares, like, where does that come spatially? Where is that? Is that all of what we're seeing colored on this map? Or
so if you look at, I'm going to start down here. So everything north and west of this black line right here, over here to Alberta. So all the rest of that is caribou habitat: Callender, Snake, Max Hamish, and West Side Fort Nelson. So the 1.65 million hectares is spread out across all 4 of those herd ranges. Right. So like in Callender, it's almost all of that is being managed for habitat, for positive habitat trend. Less in Snake, less in Max Hamish, less in West. But yeah, it's that 1.6 is spread out across those 4 herd ranges.
is it like green plus yellow? Is it like,
visually it's 1 and 2, because those are the areas that would have, or envisioned, proposed to have no net new footprint. Areas 3 that there's development as a compatible activity, and 4, those areas aren't included in that kind of 21 to 63% managed for positive habitat trend.
I feel like what you both just said, Chris and Mike, would be really good to put in the newspaper or a 1-pager, because there's a lot of people, myself included, when I read it, I thought there was 1.6 million hectares of a new protected area only at the west side of Fort Nelson, and that was really confusing to a lot of people, but especially if it's just that type 1. I'm not sure if this is how you refer to it, the type 1 and the type 2. Then the rest of us on the call, a lot of us on the call, can share this knowledge with others. I think that would be that's a number 1 concern from many people.
Yeah, appreciate that for sure. Yeah. I can say when as we can share more information, then certainly, we'll clear some of that up. But
I'll just remind people too that we are going to be putting this on YouTube. It'll be up tomorrow. So I think there's a lot of clarity that's coming out here today, and we can, anybody that's coming to you with concerns, we could encourage them to watch this.
Yeah, absolutely.
One more question, sorry, just to jump in, but AOI is area of interest, and is that right? Area of interest, and is that for your? And are those areas of interest targeted for restoration, or did I miss what the AOI was for?
So AOI stands for areas of interest, and so there's a few of these that are outside of the previously delineated caribou ranges. But yet through either telemetry data from Alberta or just in conversations at the table and Fort Nelson First Nation bringing forward what they understand, we identified other areas that are outside of existing ranges that have caribou in them, or they have suitable caribou habitat. So this is, just expanding our interest into these areas. And so now they're part of ongoing monitoring efforts to try to better understand caribou use in those areas. And then with regards to restoration, there's probably a need to post as a implementation item out of this plan is to actually release guidance on prioritized restoration areas within to support this. Over the past couple of years, we've had a couple workshops with First Nations, industry, and local government and others to develop criteria to prioritize the landscape. And Fort Nelson First Nations really been leading the way in terms of identifying major restoration areas for boreal caribou thus far. So we're anticipating that there'll be need to update more like tactical guidance on where restoration projects are envisioned to take place, and work to developing prescriptions so that way more and more work can be completed.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, no problem.
One more question. Mike, can you just tell us again, or Chris, sorry, self-sustainability is defined as what again for caribou?
For caribou, self-sustainability is that there's not a need for direct management action. So in this case, we link it to habitat. So if habitat is largely intact, caribou have a higher likelihood of achieving self-sustainability, but it means that we wouldn't be pulling other management levers such as predator management or doing things like maternal penning and predator exposures and even restoration activities in theory, that the herds themselves would be able to be stable in a place that they can really take on if there's mass mortality events, that there's some level of resiliency built into the herd numbers that they can rebound and not be at a major conservation concern.
I see, I know that there's a couple, I can see there's a couple trappers on the Zoom, and I know a couple others were trying to join, but did not have the technological ability to get onto Zoom. And I feel, I don't know if any of the folks that trap want to say anything, but just in the past week, my general observation from being in the air and on the ground a lot with the caribou is that their predators are a very large consideration. I don't know if you're going to talk about it later, sorry,
Yep,
but
we are.
okay, I'll wait till then.
Okay. So proposed implications for forestry under this recovery scenario would be, so right quick, we're looking at here, this top map is the base case timber harvesting land base for the province. So it's all this green that's scattered out throughout the Fort Nelson district. The map below it is if we overlay the management types 1 and 2, which is that light yellow color, you can see visually how it's overlapping timber harvesting land base. And so that means that because it would be restricted from forestry, essentially we are reducing the timber harvesting land base in this area by 24%. So currently we're at 870,000 hectares of THLB. That would be reducing it down to 661,000 hectares. That would equate into a 16% reduction in the allowable annual cut per year. And so there's a difference here because not every hectare of timber harvesting land base is equal. Now, some hectares of THLB will produce 300 plus cubic meters per hectare. Some other hectares will only produce 120 to 150 cubic meters per hectare. So it's all timber harvesting land base, but depending on what you're cutting out, which hectares you're actually cutting out, will have a different effect on the total amount of allowable annual cut that remains available. And so we base that on all that information that we gathered as we were doing the planning phase and we're able to estimate a 16% reduction in the AEC under this particular recovery scenario. Currently, we have a AAC of 2.582 million cubic meters available for harvest per year. That number does not include the community forest. The community forest is incremental to that 2.582 million. So we're actually right at 2.8 million that's available within this timber supply area for harvest. We would reduce this 2.582 down to 2.162 million hectares. That's at 16% reduction. It's about a 420,000 cubic meter reduction. But the community forest is completely unaffected by this recovery scenario. So we did not overlap management types 1 or 2 with any of the boundaries of the community forest. So that full 217,000 cubic meters that's in there it remains available for harvest. So we're actually a little over 2.3 million cubic meters total that would remain available for harvest under this recovery scenario. And that is not just spread across that TSA, but drilled down to a targeted economic fiber supply at this volume based on the stand volumes, the leading species, site index, age class, cycle times, and the investment information that we've got from past investment opportunities. Proposed implications for oil and gas. As we said before, it maintains conditional access to existing rights holders on all of those yellow areas, that management type 2. So we're not cutting them off. It places a time-bound moratorium on issuing any new tenure. So Energy and Mines and Oil and Gas will continue to monitor the progress of this recovery plan, as well as the changes in market demand, but we'll at the beginning set a time-bound moratorium where they won't be issuing new tenure until things start to change. It will require updated planning and policy or planning and operating measures for oil and gas, both within existing footprint, within areas where development is allowed, as well as going a little beyond that, as Tom asked the question a minute ago about what if they do need to disturb the surface within those yellow areas, that we'd want to look at the application of offsets for that, so that we maintain that positive habitat trend, even within areas where we may experience some new surface disturbance. And so, yeah, total implication is to maintain a positive habitat trend, even as oil and gas comes back to the area at some point. And so what we're looking at here is just an industry socioeconomic assessment. And it's just geared toward industry and using the 2 main industries as a proxy from a socioeconomic assessment. What we can't really measure here are, the values of Fort Nelson First Nations cultural values, the amount of product that would be brought forward by establishing and building a restoration economy and taking advantage of that ongoing funding that's coming the way, and the focus to restore this area. So we're really just looking at, okay, well, what's available out there on the land base underneath this recovery scenario, and what does that mean in sort of a volume and or dollar and cents perspective. So from a forestry perspective, as I said before, under this recovery scenario, there will be a total of about 2.38 million cubic meters available for harvest per year. That amount would support around 1,100 jobs, would produce over $16 million of annual provincial tax revenue, well over $17 million in crown stumpage, and for a total of over $187 million in annual GDP. If this total amount were to be harvested and utilized on an annual basis. We know currently that's not the case. The amount of harvesting that's going on is pretty small. But yeah, if an investment opportunity comes along and is able to harvest that, then that would be available, and this would be, the numbers and cents under this recovery scenario. From an oil and gas perspective, they're not quite as geared towards calculating volumes and dollars and cents and jobs, because there's such volatility to that market. So for instance, when we first put this information together, a year ago, we would be able to say, well, this amount of oil and gas is worth this dollar figure, but that same amount today is worth a lot more. And a year from now, it could be worth a lot less. We don't know what the volatility of those markets are going to do. So Energy and Mines and Oil and Gas were a little bit hesitant to state a dollar figure on this. And so, Tom, I see your hands up. I'll just walk through these numbers right quick, and then we'll come to your question. So, and I won't go through all of these. They broke this out by herd range, but if we just looked at the West Side Fort Nelson range, it's 837,000 hectares under. So there's a estimated 3 trillion cubic feet. That's the TCF. So 3 trillion cubic feet of oil and gas estimated within I believe that's conventional tenure under, that is under tenure. And then within that same herd range, there's an estimated 72 trillion cubic feet of oil and gas that is untenured, for a total of 114 trillion cubic feet within that particular herd range. Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I'd mentioned it last time. This is the third time I've watched it. And the first time you had a different slide up. You explained that because oil and gas asked you not to have it because the figures weren't what they are now. I think that was in 2017 that the first slide you had up that showed the conventional and unconventional natural gas resources there was worth about $402 billion.
Yeah.
It'd be quite a lot more than that now that, we're looking at $100 oil and $5 gas. And I don't know, it seems to me like this whole area are kind of leaning towards the viability of keeping a good forest industry going. And I don't think you're putting enough emphasis on keeping petroleum and natural gas going in this area, because there's lots of new critical infrastructure already in place out there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we'll have to have some good discussion on that when we have our face-to-face.
For sure. Yeah, no, for sure. It's I think you can see, you see restriction, the same amount of areas being restricted from forestry and oil and gas equally. The areas that we're leaving open to oil and gas and forestry are that's that same footprint. But yeah, there's a lot of those existing liabilities or existing tenures from an oil and gas perspective that we're saying no new surface disturbance. Luckily they can largely work within a similar footprint. They can continue to make use of existing infrastructure. When you have these high gas prices, that they can certainly, compared to forestry operation, oil and gas can afford to do offsetting where forestry largely can't. But I want to, and I appreciate this question, Tom, and I want to continue to reinforce through all these sessions is that we can't allow industry to dictate how we recover caribou. We as a province, as a jurisdiction, we have to do something to recover, to start recovering these herds, to start to change those declining population trends. If we don't, we are at risk of the federal government under the Species at Risk Act stepping in and doing it themselves. And they have most recently indicated to the province that their intention would be to simply protect the unprotected portions of caribou habitat. That's a lot more than 2.5 million hectares that would fall potentially under protection through the federal government herd planning. And so we are really working hard here to put forward a made in BC plan that, there's going to be some restrictions there, but not at the level that it could be if we lost control of this herd planning. And so you're absolutely right. We need to really consider oil and gas, and if they come back, what that means. We don't want to lose out certainly on that potential economic stimulus that could be brought about. But we do have to recover these herds, and we got to take a bit of a caribou first approach to it. Mike Gilbert, you got your hand up? Go ahead.
Yeah, Chris, can you characterize any kind of a breakdown of those 1,132 jobs? Are they direct, indirect, induced? What's the
Both.
makeup and what's the quality of the work that might generate? What's the
Yeah,
extent?
so that 1,100 jobs is based on a coefficient from the Northern Interior Forest Industry. So they basically just take all the information from all the different mills, which is not necessarily all applicable to the Fort Nelson TSA, but that gives them a coefficient to say essentially a cubic meter of wood is worth this much of a job. And so when you add those together, you just multiply that coefficient and you get those jobs. But it's a mix. That 1,100 would be a mix of direct jobs, which would be, less of a percentage of that $1,100 or 1,100 jobs. You'd have all your contract, all your field work. So yeah, you'd have direct in the mill jobs, direct in the bush jobs, transportation, and then there would be some of that 1,100 would be, some other contract or auxiliary jobs, but we don't have, it's hard to say an exact breakdown based on cubic meters, because that amount of cubic meters flowing through a pellet mill would be much different than that amount of cubic meters flowing through a dimensional lumber mill. So you also have to factor in what type of operation, what type of product are you producing for those 1,100 jobs.
So to simplify that question a little bit, does that figure include forestry only jobs, or does that include
that's forestry
induced jobs in the community?
Yeah, no, that's forestry. It's not spin-off jobs in the community. So like, more people going to the grocery store or cafes or
right,
restaurants,
okay,
things like that.
Good. Thanks for the clarity.
Sure. So we've mentioned a little bit throughout this presentation about support tools, the habitat support tools that we see coming in the form of restoration investment, as well as the habitat management to mitigate the impacts of industrial development, which is essentially what this recovery scenario is based on, is managing the habitat and industry. And then there's a host of population support tools that the whole province initiates or uses across all the caribou herds across the province at different levels. Things like maternal pinning to protect pregnant cows until they have a chance to calve. Exclosures that they can live in that just keeps predators out, and so it's sort of a full-time thing for those animals. Supplemental feeding to just help support the population, and then the big one being obviously predator management. There is a predator management plan for the whole Northeast region that includes the boreal herds, but certainly the work that's being done is focused on the alpine herds within this region, and that is because of the effectiveness of aerial predator management for those alpine herds. You have that ability to get into the river valleys and the canyons and pick up wolf tracks effectively and track them down and be able to make an effective predator management from an aerial perspective. We don't have that advantage in these boreal herds when they're flat plains and those animals are really spread out, both the caribou and other prey species and the predators themselves. And so much more difficult to just get in a helicopter and start flying out in a massive area and being able to spot wolves and manage them through that method. That's not to say that it's not possible, but we got to figure that out. And so essentially once we land a recovery scenario that addresses the habitat and sort of sets the stage for that long-term recovery for these herds, we do need to figure out how to implement an effective predator management program specific to these 4 boreal herds. And so that is something that'll require a planning process, and that's something that the province intends to do as a collaborative effort with Fort Nelson First Nation and the other interested First Nations in these herds, as well as the municipality and the locals and trappers. We need to get to that planning phase, but first we need to land a plan that addresses the habitat satisfy the federal government, and then we can move into this how to make predator management an effective tool for these herds. Because as Sonia can tell you, she was investigating mortalities just earlier this week, and it sounded like a few of them. And maybe not all of them were from predators, but I think it's evident that they continue to put pressure on these herds, and we are going to have to figure out that support mechanism to give the habitat a chance to rebound over a 40 to 50 year period of time. Mike, is your hand up from before, or did you have another question? Maybe not. I see Sonia's got her hand up, and then Jeff Thomas. So Sonia, go ahead.
I was the placeholder for Jeff Thompson as he figured out how to raise his hand. But I will also just say, like, I hear what you're saying about the predator management in the mountain, but I can say that as I've been doing the mortality investigations this last little bit, I've flown right over top of wolves that were in the middle of wetland complexes, and it was very easy to see them from quite far away. And so I don't think anybody is a fan of, killing hundreds of thousands of wolves out of helicopters. But if we're serious about caribou, I really feel that as soon as we can possibly get into that predator management piece, I understand that once the habitat component is prepared, I think it's really important. And I also think we have a lot of knowledge in our community around predator management, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. We have a lot of really active trappers, and it's not just wolves, it's wolverines. But I'll pass it over to Jeff if that's okay.
Yeah, for sure. Jeff, you're on mute if you're talking.
There we go. Sorry, little technologically inept here, but I'm working on it. You sort of answered some my question there. Like, over the years, we've seen hundreds of thousands of dollars pumped into aerial predator management. Now, will we start to see maybe some funding to trappers to increase their ability to manage predators on trap lines? Like, when we're out on the trap line, it's all out of pocket, and yeah, we do reap some monetary benefits from the price of fur, but I don't know if you guys are aware of fur markets lately. They're not very good. Is that something you could see potentially down the road, is funding directly to trappers to help with predator management?
It's something we'll have to figure out. Like, it's something we got to go through that process to figure out, what we can or can't do. I mean, my understanding of provincial legislation regarding wildlife is that the province cannot, they can't pay a bounty essentially, but that doesn't mean there's not some other method in which funding can be directed and be able to support this program. It costs, predator management costs money, however you go about it. So it's just sort of a matter of like finding a way that is broadly acceptable across the province, from a legal standpoint and policy and procedure. But it's something that we got to figure out. I mean, I'm going to speak completely out of turn here. I just, having been on this file for a while and working with these folks for the last several years, to me, it makes sense that there's some combination of a ground management program that supports an aerial program, or vice versa. In some way, they got to work to really make it an effective method. But yeah, we got to figure that out. We got to do it through a collaborative planning process, and it'll be something that's right on the heels of this recovery planning that we're currently doing. Tom, you got your hand up? Go ahead.
Yeah, just to follow up on what Jeff was saying there, like, the trappers up here, Blair and the guys, they've taken, the last few years, they've taken over 200 wolves out of here. And I know Marty Wells and Brent Monroe have got a significant number there also. And we, in the past, we have funded through Northeast BC Wildlife, we've had government give us money to house, and then we can allocate that money for, we don't call it a bounty, but
Mhm.
you know, we can buy gas or help them get their machines in different areas where they can't. And you know, there is an avenue there that the money could be given to Northeast BC Wildlife and we can allocate it out.
Yeah. It's those kinds of things that we'll get figured out as we move into that planning process. Yeah. So thanks for that, Tom. I appreciate it. Sonia, go ahead.
Just hammering home that point though, Northeast BC Wildlife Fund really wants to be involved in that when it's gonna come out, and along with the Fort Nelson Trappers Association.
Mhm.
I had a question around supplemental feeding. So all of the population support tools, those are like broad level, what happens for caribou. Are all these 4 points being considered for the caribou around us in Fort Nelson?
I would say these are the tools that are available if required. The nearest supplemental feeding site is down just south of Powder King Mountain Resort, down Kennedy Siding Road, and that was in response to a wildfire that burned through a lot of the habitat that the caribou were using just before winter. So it was deemed necessary to be able to feed them, to be able to boost their body condition, to let them go through the winter. And you know, it's a tool that we would have in case of, let's say, a major wildfire event, and we were anticipating that caribou might be adversely impacted, and we want to ensure that they have proper nutrition. So those are kind of more intensive projects, but they're available, and you know, there a lot of science is going into them, and a lot of research and we're better understanding how those tools can be used across all caribou in BC.
I guess on the flip side of that, and that's a really interesting place to go to see if anybody has the chance to go down that road and see where the feeding station is. But what we were talking about at the very beginning of the meeting before we started is the snow. And, you know, just like we're not too sure when the wildfire event's going to happen, it's going to happen, we're not too sure, but the level of snow that we have right now, I know that it's already impacting our wildlife, all our wildlife, but especially caribou. So is there and obviously we can't really control the amount of snow that we're getting. Is there consideration around snow depth, snow cresting, like things that are completely out of our control that are probably going to result in some significant mortality events? If we're trying to go to self-sustaining herds and population, I don't think we can do anything about the impact that the snow is having on wildlife. So is there a discussion in the plan about that?
I would say we're nearing the end of the presentation, and it's to address your question now also means to address a previous question that you raised in the chat, which is how is future habitat taken into account insofar as climate change? We understand that, you know, as we're experiencing climate change, there's going to be different effects on caribou. And Sonia, I think one of our first conversations up in Fort Nelson was actually about caribou and climate change. So there's a lot of ways that weather impacts snow conditions, which then impact caribou's ability to forage, and the way that predators move across the landscape, and caribou the same. So there's a level of uncertainty in all of this, and climate change definitely compounds that uncertainty. So when we're trying to talk about, you know, how populations might respond to one management measure or another, we just try to explain what the uncertainty is with regards to a changing climate. But there's a lot of bright minds, yours included, that, you know, help be able to understand how some of these climate change effects may impact wildlife and habitat going forward. So I think it's just kind of part of that where you don't have a great answer, but you say like we'll monitor it and we'll try to make informed decisions based off of what we know.
Thanks, Mike.
I know it's hard because you you guys can't share the plan with us. So probably once we have the opportunity to read the plan itself, then it will help us as well.
There's a lot more background information from a literature perspective that's built into provincial recovery plans that you know, isn't for everybody. So in these engagement sessions, we're trying to keep it higher level, less jargony.
So just a couple more slides to go through. Next step, sort of a timeline. We're right here in the middle, February to April, doing public and stakeholder engagement. So like I said before, this is just initial engagement this week, just to kind of get the conversation started and start getting some of these questions and feedback. We'll be able to make the plan publicly available in mid-March, the rest of this information. And so circle back around for more engagement sessions. All of the feedback and input from these engagement sessions, both now and in the future, will inform further revisions of this plan, of this recovery scenario, as we work our way towards coming to a consensus recommendation. That's at the planning table between the province, Fort Nelson First Nation, Northern Rockies regional municipality, looking to hit that sort of June or July, getting into the summer when we reach that and are able to dot the I's and cross the T's and send this recommendation on to the minister for her review and hopefully endorsement, sort of late summer, probably into the fall. It's hard to say how long it'll take once we send it to the minister for her review. So yeah, I think probably we're looking really at fall of this year to be the earliest to get an answer on the recommendation. Somebody on their iPhone has their hand up. I don't see a name, but go ahead. Maybe tell us who you are and go ahead.
Sorry about that. It's the first time in on an iPhone. It's Abigail.
Hey, Abigail.
Hello. I'm just curious about the end game on this. When do we have you planned for when it's deemed to be successful and therefore unnecessary?
So it'll never not be necessary to do this, at least within our, when we're still going to have the mental capacity. I'm talking about the folks here on this call to recognize where we're at in the world. We're looking at 40 to 50 years for us to see the habitat regenerate to enough to really support that self-sustainability for the long term. We'll figure out the population support tools that we can do in order to keep these herds going during that time. Restoration efforts will obviously help to contribute that. So the more restoration we can do, the quicker we can achieve those that 65% or better undisturbed habitat, which really starts to pull that or push that probability of those populations achieving self-sustainability across these herds. We'll be monitoring. So the end game essentially here is to get endorsement at the provincial level to implement this recovery scenario. That moves us into implementation, which is formulating the legal orders that we'd be able to place on the land base that would restrict that industrial development within those management type 1 and 2, the green and yellow areas, so that we can really start to protect and restore that core caribou habitat. We'll have to continue to monitor that as we go along and see what adjustments need to be made. So, the end game here is to get these populations to self-sustaining self-sustainability. And we know that if the better the habitat is and the more of their habitat that's intact, the higher probability those individual herds have of achieving that. But as Sonia was just pointing out, and as we kind of started this presentation off with, there are factors that are out of our control, or at least that take the entire global population to make a difference and start changing some of those things. Yeah, I'll be totally honest with you, Abigail. It's possible we can make all the best efforts that we absolutely can towards these herds, and we could still see them continue to decline because of those larger environmental factors that are not within our control. But we can't not do anything. We can't just sit here and watch them disappear. And we know that we have an effect on certain aspects that have fragmented that habitat and greatly contributed to their decline. And so that's what we're working on with this recovery scenario and what we hope to achieve. I don't know if that answered your question or not. But.
Yeah, I'm just trying to kind of conceptualize, even say 10 years down the road. So we've got an economy that's developed around restoration and reclamation, and we're doing that. We are successful in pulling back all of these sites of conflict, maybe.
Yeah.
And then at that point, I believe you said that there would be never any future possibility of redevelopment in those areas that have been obviously sponsored by government, etc., to reclaim. So I'm just wondering if we have to sort of get our minds around the fact that in this area we are going to have, we as in industry, we locals, we the general population are going to have 65% less of the land base that we live in the middle of as explorable by us. Is that where that's going?
Well, it's across those 4 different herds. There's some different percentages of the amount of land that is being managed for positive habitat trend. In order to achieve positive habitat trend, you either have to just restrict industry from occurring, or I shouldn't say restrict industry from occurring, restrict industry from disturbing the surface. Because if an industry can go into an existing footprint, then you're not adding to the amount of disturbance. So it's that's that need to create additional surface disturbance in a habitat that's not currently disturbed or that's not as disturbed. So adding to that fragmentation of the habitat. That's what we have to change that trend in order to change the declining trend in the populations. So I was trying to think of the second part of your question. Oh, so does that restrict you guys? Well, yeah, it is going to restrict where industry can function. You see within management type 1, the intent is to just not allow surface development or surface disturbance to happen within the green areas. Ideally for the yellow areas too, but because of the existing liabilities and tenures from an oil and gas perspective, that if that had to incur new surface disturbance, there would need to be offsetting by those industries, by those proponents, in order to continue promoting that positive habitat trend within the yellow areas, the management type 2. But we would not see forestry going back into those yellow areas. Now, as we said before that, I'm sorry, go ahead.
So or for that matter, oil and gas exploration.
So yeah, through the issuance of new tenures, so there is going to be a time-bound moratorium, or there would be from this recovery scenario if it is endorsed. There would be a time-bound moratorium on the issuance of new tenures, which would allow for new surface development or new industrial oil and gas development. But it's, we're monitoring the oil and gas and energy and mines. We'll monitor that over time and see what needs to be adjusted, or if that, when that time period moratorium runs out, we would then be able to allow new tenures to be awarded, which would come along with new surface disturbance from more oil and gas exploration. If that is the realization that we get to, again, we have the tool of offsetting ratios in order to allow that to happen, but still continue to drive that population, or sorry, that positive habitat trend within those areas. So we're not saying forever and ever there will never be oil and gas in here. That's not what this plan is designed to do.
Yeah, Chris, could I just add one more thing to your point?
Sure.
On the oil and gas exploration, particularly, like a lot of the the wrinkles or the fine details on terms of what activities can take place and what are the mitigations of those activities, those are elements of the plan that need to be worked out through implementation and process with industry after a plan is endorsed. And so if the plan goes forward, there's going to be spin-off processes to update guidance for activities within each of those management types, both from a forestry perspective and a petroleum and natural gas perspective. A lot of this area has been explored quite significantly. That's why there's so many seismic lines crisscrossing the landscape. And one of the measures that you can ask as a regulator is for any proponent to demonstrate whether or not they can reuse existing data. And there's also a lot of advancements in seismic programs to either reduce the footprint of a seismic program itself or have no footprint. So like some of these larger conventional seismic lines that people are used to seeing in the Fort Nelson Boreal Forest, those types of disturbances probably wouldn't even occur going forward under a new seismic program or exploration program by a company in the first place, based on existing information that's available or new technologies. So there's a lot of just nuance to it, but there's a commitment by the province during implementation to be working with the industries that do that work to be able to identify, you know, what are the mitigation measures or offset measures that are applicable here. Hope that provides some clarity and insight to your question.
Thank you.
Thanks for that, Mike. Sonia, you got your hand up? Go ahead.
I have since we have Chris and Mike on a Friday night, and I really want to make sure I wrap my head around all of this too. And so I have an oil and gas question, and then I have an AAC question. It's not saying oil and gas activity is ceasing. Like it's the oil and gas activity and the oil and gas footprint that is currently on the landscape is still going to be able to be producing. Those wells can be producing, those pipelines that are running are still going to run. It's not that okay.
Yes.
And I think that maybe when people hear the 65%, it's really hard to picture when we just see such a big map at such a big scale. And I really like the idea of sending around the Google or KMLs or KMZ so we can understand, especially to know that it's not meant to shut down the oil and gas industry. It's just the expansion. So probably about 10 or 12 years ago, should this have been what was on the table, it would have had a lot of impact, I think, because everything was still developing and there was still heavy disturbance. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, well, to your point, there was a 2010 plan that placed protections and restrictions within these herds to the amount of about, I think I said 800,000 hectares. That was about 21% of those 4 ranges together, and that obviously was not enough.
Okay. And my question around the AAC is, so I don't know where the footprint of the community forest is, but it seems to me that we interpret the discussion around the AAC as there are no caribou or core habitat in the footprint of the community forest tenure area. Is that what we take from that? Like if
No, there is. Yeah, there is some, but there was a little bit of overlap, and I forget exactly the number. It wasn't a lot, but there was some originally. There is some caribou use and core caribou habitat that does overlap portions of the community forest. We had a long, hard look at each other at the planning table, and that's me and Mike, Fort Nelson, Northern Rockies, looking at each other and saying, are we gonna cut back on the CFA after it was just awarded? We did a lot of analysis that Mike could probably speak to around, okay, well, if we did allow forestry, if we move that line work off of this overlap with the CFA boundary, you know, how much of a negative effect is that going to have on those different herds where you see those overlaps at? And I think we found that the increased risk to those particular herds by eliminating that overlap with the CAA boundary was minimal, and it made sense to not impact the boundaries of that community forest.
And is there a publicly available shapefile of the community forest tenure polygon?
Should be, yeah, spatial, yeah, like a KMZ.
Yeah, or a
There should
shapefile? Okay.
You might, at this point, since it's legal now, you might want to go to the CFA partners. I believe that could either be Catherine Wolfenden or Lawrence Forsberg that are sort of heading that up. So yeah, I would direct you to them now that essentially it's legal out there. It's their liability now.
And so I know there's lots of folks that had to drop off, but how does the information from today feed into what happens next?
Yeah, so we're gathering this information and we will. So actually, that kind of takes me to the next slide here. Ongoing engagement, right? So continue doing regional engagement with other interested First Nations, other stakeholders. Continue having these regional engagement tables. Sort of we're done for this week, but we get that, we can release that draft plan, and we'll have more of these coming back to the Northern Rocky stakeholders, the Northeast Roundtable, coming back through the Chamber of Commerce again, and having those. So continuing Indigenous and non-Indigenous community engagement sessions. We're also going to set up with Mike and some other folks from the Caribou team a drop-in session at the Fort Nelson District Office for folks that want to have that come in and have that face-to-face time and sit with somebody to really fully understand and provide that feedback. And so we'll schedule that for after we can publicly release the draft plan. Probably looking at like the first time that last week of March. So we'll set those things up. Also in mid-March, there'll be an online posting period and a feedback form. So that covers the entire province. Obviously, everybody in the province has access to that, to where these sessions have been certainly targeted towards you folks, the region, starting with Fort Nelson, and then obviously looping in the rest of the Northeast region there. And so we'll continue that stuff. All of this information will be amalgamated into what we heard reports that we'll release back to the public, so everybody can see what everybody had to say across the board and across the province there. And those reports will demonstrate how we take into consideration all of everything that we hear, all the feedback, and then that'll inform the revisions that the planning table makes as we continue pushing this forward. So we'll be able to report back out on that to folks. Abigail, you got your hand up? Go ahead.
I apologize if this is a repeat. I chimed in a little bit late at the beginning of the meeting, but I'm curious to know historically how far back you were able to go in determining the population levels for the caribou, those 4 herds that are around.
Well, the Indigenous and local knowledge and those observations and monitoring have go back 30 plus years. The population estimates, the growth rates that are based on adult female survival and calf recruitment and the percentage that calves make up of population. We showed information back for the last 8 years between 2014 and 2021 that showed us across all 5 of the herds, an average declining population growth. But there's information that goes back further than that. Mike, I don't know if you know off the top of your head, like how much that population estimate.
Yeah, I can
goes.
speak a little bit to it. I'd say that there wasn't a really good, on these herds, the Boreal caribou, they've been less understood compared to some of the mountain caribou that a lot of other British Columbians are familiar with, as well as the Northern Rockies. So while there was early monitoring, it was inconsistent throughout the 90s, and in the 2000s, more effort was spent on investing in collar And in 2010, after the Boreal Caribou Implementation Plan was endorsed, that kickstarted a large collaring program. So that's why we're more confident in our numbers over the last, since 2010, because we've had a more robust knowledge because we've been putting more collars out there. So we've, we have this long term, like the locals have told us, and there's been withdrawals from indigenous hunting for a lot of these caribou based off of something that they witnessed. So, that's my understanding of it, that the caribou have declined at least since the last 30 years, but we have solid evidence now that there's ongoing declines over the last 8 years.
Chris, I just want to jump in because I'm cognizant of time. We have gone half an hour over.
Oh.
I do want to thank everybody that has stayed on, but I also want to recognize that we've lost probably about half the audience because we have gone over that much. So I'm happy to leave it open if people want to continue to talk, but kind of think we should draw the formal part of it closed. And I will like I said, happy to keep it going if you want to continue to chat, but just so we recognize the time.
Sure. Yeah. No, I appreciate that, Bev. Thank you. Jeff, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
What is there data collected on the mortality rate from collaring caribou? Like what percentage died just from being stressed from collaring?
Hey, Jeff, I don't have the answers specifically, but every once in a while, despite best efforts, there's badness, whether it's in bad snowpack, some caribou die while we're trying to put collars on them. That information's all available. So if it's of interest to you, I'd invite you to send me an email, or I could get your contact. I could follow up with you on that specific metric.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
I'm just trying to figure out how to put my hand down again.
Yeah, if you type your email address in the chat, I can send you an email next week.
Okay, thanks.
Abigail, go ahead.
I'm just, last question. I'm just trying to formulate in my head the annual allowable cut. So originally it was 2.5 plus the 217,000 that belongs to the community forest that would be reduced by, I think you said 25%, if I'm correct. Just stop me if I'm wrong.
16%.
16? Okay, so the harvest capacity would be, no, the footprint is down 25%. That's right?
Yeah, the timber harvesting land base would be reduced
THLD,
by
yeah.
24%. Yeah.
Okay, got it. Okay, so that would be down by 16. The AAC would be down by 16%. Now, the thing that I can't remember is whether the indigenous allocations of cuts falls inside that AAC or if it is outside of the AAC. And if it is outside of the AAC, is the recovery program going to impact the allocations that are attributed to the 5 bands in the area for their use?
So currently there are no strictly First Nations tenures or allocated volumes within the Fort Nelson timber supply area. There are some mandates that Fort Nelson First Nation and Prophet River First Nation could pursue, but they haven't pursued them. So that volume that could eventually be put into First Nations tenures, that's part of that 2.5 million cubic meter AAC. If they develop those First Nation tenures at some time in the future, if they're area-based tenures like a First Nation woodland license, then that volume would be put into a First Nations woodland license, and that volume would be discounted from the AAC number. It would just be available through that First Nations tenure rather than just part of the AAC number that's untenured, essentially.
Okay, so but would the land base under those, if they were to be if they were to be pursued by First Nations, would the land base fall inside the jurisdiction of the, well, potential moratoriums, I guess, or the management of the Caribou area?
It depends on where they identified that they wanted to have the boundary. So if it's so First Nation would license is an area-based tenure, so it's like a community forest. It has those actual on-the-ground boundaries. And so when a First Nation would look at developing one of those tenures, if this, if we have this recovery scenario endorsed and are implementing it, then they're going to need to look at not crossing over, like they're not going to want to develop a area-based tenure that half of it is within management type 1 or 2 where you couldn't have forestry. So they'll need to take that into consideration when they go to pursue those tenures.
Fair enough. And that as an annexation, the Treaty 8 pursuit of the blueberry decision will affect the caribou habitat program. How? And if I missed it at the beginning, I apologize.
Where blueberry would be involved in caribou recovery planning would be on the Chinchaga caribou herd. That is not part of this recovery scenario. So blueberry's traditional territory does not overlap any of these 4 herds in the Fort Nelson Timber Supply area that we're talking about. There are other Treaty 8 First Nations that are interested in these herds, and so Prophet River, Denetah over in Alberta, and then also there's a Treaty 11 First Nation in the Northwest Territories, Acho-Deni-Quo First Nation, that we've been working with and engaging all during this time to get their input and the feedback and where their interest lies with regards to covering these herds. But largely the rest of Treaty 8 is to the south, and their traditional territories don't overlap these herds the way Fort Nelson and Prophet and the other 2 nations do.
And have they formed part of the management plan as it is at the moment? Of the engagements, are they involved?
So we've been engaging those nations all along during the technical and strategic planning phases, and we'll continue to engage with them as we work towards a recommendation.
And the Casca?
So Casca, we do talk to them. They certainly their traditional territory does not overlap. They pretty much butt right up against the Max Hamish herd, but they don't actually extend over into it. They have some interest as far as trapliners and things like that, and some use of the land from a cultural value perspective. So we'll take their information into consideration as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a final question.
Sure.
Last one, hopefully. No knocks against you, Sonia. I'm just looking at the time, and my stomach's growling here.
It's really nice to be able to talk to both of you and be able to be really present during the presentation. So just a question that a bunch of us have been wondering about: when is this happening for the Northern Mountain caribou? And I remember when we had the big caribou meeting at the rec center, Joelle was talking a lot about that happening. Can you comment on that? Or I know we're focused on Boreal, but when Northern Mountain caribou planning might be happening?
So we certainly have been doing more collaring. So we've been getting more callers on more of those herds, doing more surveys to try to build our knowledge, because we don't necessarily have the information that says that those Northern Mountain caribou herds are in decline. But I mean, the local observations do say that for sure. But we need more collar data. We need more telemetry data to fully understand that. So we're doing that now, and that will inform when we'll need to, if and when we'll need to start doing herd planning for those particular herds. So it's hard to put a timeline on it at this point.
Yeah, I could say that there's no commitment by the province to advanced herd planning for northern mountain caribou, given their conservation status as a special concern. But whenever we talk to people that live amongst those caribou, you know, we hear the conservation concern. It's just so there has been some work in recent years to develop a bit of a strategy for the province for us to be able to put more money and projects towards northern mountain caribou, because a lot of us recognize that these are some of our most robust herds and with the greatest numbers, and that there needs to be a lot of emphasis there. So while there's some planning projects that are happening up with some of the northern mountain herds that are First Nations led, the province hasn't initiated herd planning for any of the neighboring herds like the Muskwa or Frog or Taga at this point in time.
Would those herd plans be the drivers of regulation changes?
The herd plans as they exist are a summary of knowledge for the northern mountain herds. So they would have a lot of that information, but and they'd probably be referenced perhaps, but they don't have any recommendations within them. So there's no herd planning process that can make a recommendation for reg changes, for example.
Is there any, and so whatever publicly available knowledge on the northern mountain caribou would be on that Eco Explore, the website, not the conservation, I just forgot what it's called right now, but the one where the government reports are on?
I can perhaps just post a link to the Caribou Recovery Program website.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And then from there, people should be able to navigate where you can find more money. And I'll actually post a map where you can interact with all the herds and see the draft herd plans. So
Cool.
if you go
Be
to
awesome.
this. Yeah.
Thank you very, very much for withstanding all the questions, both of you.
No, thanks for all, guys. This is what we're looking for, is exactly the more questions, the more input is exactly what we need in order to be able to move forward on this plan.
Well, it definitely helps us be able to talk in the community too. So for myself, it helps me be able to talk in the community with intelligence of what's happening when people ask, and know where to go to look for more information. So thank you a lot. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
And
And anybody can always email me and or Michael, or reach out to us. You know, you don't have to wait for the next session. If you've got a concern or a question you need answered, reach out to us. We're happy to talk about this.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. Thank you very much, Chris, and thanks everybody for the participation. Clearly, this is an issue of concern people are interested in, and it's so important that we get good information and are informed. So certainly, I'll commit if you would like to do this again once you're able to release the plan. We're happy to host you again. Maybe not in the Friday night of a long weekend.
Okay. All right.
Definitely willing to do it again. And once you are able to release that, if you can just send me the information so I can share it out on my channels as well.
Yeah,
Perfect. Thanks so much. And thank you guys for sticking it out right to the bitter end. We'll do it again soon. Everybody have a good weekend.
Thanks, Beth.
Good way to
Thanks,
spend
everybody.
a Friday night. Bye. Thanks.
Have a great
Take care.
weekend.
Bye-bye.